Very harsh developments have come back to back from Russia. Wagner has taken a huge step forward in honor of Putin's promise. Wagner wanted to be forgiven when not the slightest step was taken for this amnesty. The Wagner soldiers began to experience very difficult days in Russia. However, a large number of names in the Wagner army have taken action. The Wagner soldiers who said that they were not comfortable here and wanted to go to Belarus stunned the whole world. This raid on the parliament buildings scared Putin a lot, and the sounds of ambulances echoed back and forth in the Kremlin. Taking advantage of this incident, the Ukrainian Azov battalion organized such an operation against the Russians that all the media talked about it in the last days of Russia. A very active agenda is being noticed by the entire Russian people. First of all, Wagner's failed coup attempt and the unstable and powerless steps taken against Ukraine after that are things that have been reacted to a lot by the Russian people. At the same time, Putin has been searching for many solutions. Putin, who has met with high-level bureaucrats many times, talks about the situation and that the solution will come in different ways. While the reactions to Putin, who argues that he can change the failure against Ukraine, are coming back to back, the inability to solve the Wagner problem brings with it a lot of very complicated situations. But with these latest developments, it is possible to say that Putin is completely cornered. Putin began to realize what a big mistake he had made after making the war in Ukraine by authorizing generals who could not manage the war. Thinking that his authority over Wagner would be shaken if he returned from this mistake, he turned to his own domestic troubles. Instead of withdrawing the army a little more, the soldiers, members of the Wagner mercenary group who were experiencing difficulties at the front after many developments, took action under the leadership of Prigozhin and started walking towards Moscow. After that, things would turn completely in favor of Ukraine. The Russian army was completely divided into two in an instant. One of these groups was on Putin's side in every case, while the other part had completely anti-Putin thinking. However, the unexpected happened, and the blood pressure rose by simply surrounding the city in many areas. Wagner took the win into his hands after that, with the intervention of Belarusian leader Lukashenko. The parties signed peace, but Putin moved to impose very heavy sanctions, and he began to do everything in his power to let in everyone who had even the slightest connection with Wagner so far. This incident has caused a lot of trouble, and Putin's treatment of Wagner has stunned everyone. Before the peace was signed on the night of the coup, Putin had announced that they would be very warm towards Wagner. Putin, who stated that these people were deceived, said that after peace, Wagner troops will be offered offers, and there are many different possibilities. It is also thought that the declaration of peace on the night of the coup helped Prigozhin's efforts from the very beginning to keep the soldiers out of harm's way, contributing to the earlier arrival of peace. But despite these statements, Putin has taken a very big step, and things are completely mixed up. Putin began to change a lot of things after the members of the Wagner mercenary group surrendered. The warm attitude towards Wagner that he initially expressed has gone in an instant. Wagner epicenters were inspected, and all possible assets were confiscated because of a lawsuit called the Wagner case. All Wagner soldiers were prevented from getting a job, and the soldiers in this region have come to a position where they don't know what to do, due to the fact that they were also banned from leaving the country out of exile. Wagner soldiers took action to take a different step. This step has enabled Putin to face the biggest challenge so far. Although Wagner was tried to be disbanded by Putin, it was not disbanded. It is known that Prigozhin is still supported by a large number of oligarchs. These supports, on the other hand, cause Wagner to become stronger again through the intermediation of certain parallel companies. In recent statements, it has been found that the number of Wagner mercenary groups has not decreased in any way, and with that, doubts that the organization was growing began to be raised again. Allegedly, the KGB's recent research is all about how much the organization can grow. But the latest facts that have come out have shown that everything Putin is afraid of is happening. The Wagner mercenary group is about to make one of the biggest breakthroughs of recent times. The group, which initially set out to protest, decided to take a different step when it could not get permission for this. It is known that a large number of members of the Wagner mercenary group who took to the streets continued the protests in every way. However, with the Russian army being moved to a more backward position to be used against Wagner, the basis of many confusion actually began to be created. Of course, exactly at this point, when this march of Wagner mercenaries for justice was very harshly interfered with by the National Guard, the streets suddenly turned into a battlefield. On the back of these developments, Putin activated one of the most important weapons at his disposal, but it would have completely backfired. While Putin was trying to bring his own soldiers back against Wagner, Wagner suddenly began to hold demonstrations in Moscow as well. Due to the fact that the protests here are quite heavy-handed, Putin was surprised about how to react. It was at this point that the Wagner soldiers, tired of the censorship imposed by Putin, suddenly moved towards the parliament building. There were a lot of Wagner soldiers in the assembly at once. This has caused lawmakers to be afraid. This incident, which took place near the Kremlin, was described as a new coup attempt against Putin. But the reality was actually very different. Wagner soldiers headed toward the area where the lawmakers were speaking. The soldiers who expressed their desire for equality and justice through the microphones stated that they were not allowed to live in Russia. Wagner's spokesman, who said that after the coup attempt, the soldiers could not even find a job and it was impossible for them to live in such conditions, urgently demanded that the issue be raised and resolved. After that, the Wagner soldiers who demand that they be transferred to Belarus if life in Russia is not possible are waiting for a solution to show itself obligingly in the near future. After that, everything changed completely when the Wagner relationship with Belarus came to light. Belarusian leader Lukashenko continued to contact Prigozhin as he was an intermediary in the coup. However, according to the information obtained, it is known that Lukashenko has a very serious problem with the Belarusian government. Lukashenko is forced to react severely against numerous protests because he rules the country like a dictator. Krasny Orel, who emerged after Wagner began to lose power, announced that at first, he wanted to take Belarus back again. In other words, the possibility of a coup in Belarus is quite close. Along with these, Lukashenko wanted to mobilize the army, but when he realized that a serious part of the soldiers had connections with Krasny Orel, he realized that things were getting more complicated in Belarus, and after that, he moved to use force against Krasny Orel. Together with Prigozhin, he began preparations to strengthen Wagner again. Wagner's new mission has stunned the whole world. Although Lukashenko had an autocratic management mentality like Putin, he did not take any measures to protect the regime. Because of this, it was recorded as a fairly high probability that a large number of soldiers would join Krasny Orel. Wagner, on the other hand, would come into play exactly at this point. As a result of Krasny Orel, who was previously in the army, gaining more power in the near future, Lukashenko would turn Wagner into his own personal army. This would both stop the activities and prepare the ground for Wagner to become stronger again in Belarus. And this move, made after this agreement, has completely cornered Putin. And when he found out that one of his most loyal allies was collaborating with the coup plotters, Putin's authority was completely shaken. Putin was left with a much bigger problem this time. Putin began to think about the possibility that there might be a new coup behind the steps he has taken in recent days. The fact that Wagner soldiers took a very critical step and rose up against Putin and stormed the parliament surprised everyone. Putin, on the other hand, did not know what to do out of fear, thinking that he would be assassinated on this occasion. However, according to the claim, Putin fainted as the sounds of ambulances echoed in the Kremlin. Many groups who suspected that Putin had lost his life began to act more audaciously. At the same time, the people have taken action to organize celebrations, and he went next to one of his icons against Putin. But the reaction of the soldiers fighting in the Ukrainian region against this weakness has stunned the whole world. Many of the soldiers fighting in the Ukrainian region received the news that Putin had fallen from power. However, the soldiers who thought that the only person who demanded the war could no longer rule the country immediately took action. A large number of headquarters in the east of the Ukrainian front began to be abandoned, and Russian soldiers began to withdraw. These developments fell like a bomb on the agenda of the Russian media. The Russian soldiers no longer wanted to continue the war, which had no purpose. However, after the Russian people made demonstrations of joy in the streets, the Kremlin spokesman completely denied this incident. But Putin's inability to come out alone for a while after this incident and make statements completely confused the Russian people and the world press. They did not believe in this incident. And the Ukrainian army conducted an incredible operation to show that Putin is ill. After that, everything turned in favor of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army first activated its intelligence network. A lot of intelligence had been learned about Putin being ill. Besides, it was also determined by the data that Ukraine was now ahead in many areas after the withdrawal of the troops. The Ukrainian army began to conduct surveys primarily in those regions. unmanned aerial vehicles were sent to fully learn the geography of the region. The unmanned aerial vehicles drew a map of the region, and the headquarters in the region explained how simple the operation could be because almost no one had faith in Putin after what he did, and the Russian soldiers had given up continuing the war for nothing. However, the Ukrainian army decided to use one of the biggest trumps it has, the Azov Battalion. At this point, the Azov Battalion consists of the leading special forces units of Ukraine. The fact that this battalion achieved outstanding success in many operations against Russian soldiers was instrumental in their selection. There were exactly 14 Russian headquarters on the eastern front of Ukraine because they are at the very extremes. The Ukrainian army made a very big breakthrough and mobilized its troops towards these headquarters that drew the border. The Ukrainian army advanced towards this region with armored vehicles and heavy machine guns. Although the headquarters were abandoned, some soldiers loyal to Putin were also waiting in those areas. The groups that wanted to intimidate Ukraine for border security didn't have much to do, even if they backed down because Putin had voluntarily withdrawn important troops from the region and a large number of troops that he described as loyal. The reasons for his fear of the coup were revealed at this point. As time after the Ukrainian army arrived in the area with armored vehicles, it advanced towards the central headquarters, which is the most important. First of all, because they knew that Russian soldiers were following developments in Russia, they managed to blockade the first headquarters without getting caught by the observation troops. After that, the Ukrainian army immediately called for the surrender of the Russian soldiers. The Russian soldiers initially wanted to reciprocate, but Ukraine had sent both its most special soldiers, and these soldiers had very important equipment. However, the Russian soldiers decided that resistance was unnecessary, and a small number of Russian soldiers at the headquarters surrendered without a single bullet being fired. After taking over the headquarters, the Azov Battalion, which took action, caused havoc among the soldiers in the headquarters, and the 14 headquarters quickly moved to Ukrainian positions. After the Ukrainian army took these headquarters, Putin's absence of the slightest statement stunned the whole world. This also confirmed a lot of information about him being sick. But the criticism of his attitude towards this coup incident and a second Wagner case was quite reasonable. Putin has committed numerous crimes and war crimes since the moment he came to power. It is known that these have very heavy prices under normal conditions, although he cannot be tried by international courts right now because he is the head of state in Russia. Things could turn completely against Putin if he falls from power. And after this turn, Putin may be living out his last days as a free man. With this, the Ukrainian army conducted an operation again and is about to land the biggest blow yet against the Russian army. With these developments, the war has moved into Russia. The Ukrainian army has set its eyes on the munitions in Belgorod. Russia has suffered a heavy blow in the face of the mind-boggling Ukrainian operation. As a result of this operation, close to 100 tons of Russian ammunition were rendered unusable. Putin, who received the news, went crazy with anger. And then the whole world was stunned by the decisions he made for the army. In the last days of the Ukrainian-Russian war, the Ukrainian army did not let the Russians open their eyes. And thanks to many successful operations, Ukraine has completely changed the balance of the war. After that, the Ukrainian army, which used many advantages in its favor, followed a different method for its new move, and it prepared for an operation that would put Putin in a more difficult position without getting into a heated confrontation with the Russian military. Thanks to this operation, the chances of the Russian army making a move have been greatly reduced, and Ukraine has gained the opportunity to conduct larger-scale operations as a result of the successful attacks of the Ukrainian army. The Russian forces have no longer been able to offer resistance in the region. However, despite the miserable state of the army, the Kremlin's decision has not changed. The Kremlin, led by Vladimir Putin, has ordered Russian soldiers to continue the offensive no matter what. However, in the face of the latest operation of the Ukrainian army, Russian soldiers had to switch to a completely defensive position because the recent move of the Ukrainian army has greatly threatened the integrity of Russian territory. As a result of Russian President Vladimir Putin's announcement of mobilization, many Russian young people were involuntarily forced to join the army. And as a result of this situation, there was a great confusion in the Russian army because many Russian soldiers did not want to fight for Putin, who ignored their lives. Realizing this situation, Ukraine turned the situation into an opportunity. and work has begun on a plan that will completely repel Russian troops from the territory of Ukraine. The Ukrainian army has paid great attention to its intelligence network since the beginning of the war, and the latest information brought by the Ukrainian intelligence service rewrote the fate of the war. Intelligence units have been working intensively on this information for 6 months, but the intercepted data gave Ukraine a critical advantage. According to this information, all of the munitions sent by Putin to the territory of Ukraine were being transported to the collection point in the city of Belgorod, and the collected ammunition was on its way to be sent to different fronts via Belgorod. Thanks to a blow to this ammunition depot, Russia's quest for dominance on Ukrainian territory could come to an end, and the Ukrainian army, which has recently gained strength, has made an incredible attack plan with the help of this intelligence. The details of this attack proved to the whole world what a professional step the Ukrainian army has taken, continuing to gain information on the city of Belgorod. The Ukrainian army learned that ammunition in the region is collected every 3 weeks. However, there were many Russian soldiers patrolling this assembly point enough to stop an attack overland. On top of this, the Ukrainian army prepared its air force and long-range missiles as the lifeblood of the operation. On top of this, Turkish-made Baker Bayraktar B-2 unmanned combat aircraft rushed to help the flag carriers, which took off from the territory of Ukraine and carried out reconnaissance flights over Belgorod as soon as they arrived in Russia. As a result of these discoveries, the Ukrainian army found that Belgorod consisted of a valley and decided on a new move. According to this move, stopping the vehicle located at the very front of the future Russian convoy would disrupt the entire shipment. And thanks to this pause, the Ukrainian army would gain time when it could easily use long-range Patriot missiles and HIMARS. However, Ukraine, which wanted to get information about a possible Russian air defense system in the region, decided to send 2 Bayraktar kamikazes to the route in Belgorod. Thanks to this move, Ukraine saw that the route was located a little further from the assembly point and carried out an inconceivable operation. Ukraine sent flag officers to Belgorod in the first phase of the operation. After that, coordinate information was uploaded to HIMARS and long-range Patriots, and the flag bearers carried out the largest attack that the Ukrainian army has carried out since it entered its inventory. More than 20 Bayraktars advanced from a high enough altitude to avoid the Russian army's observation troops, and when the convoy approaching the region was detected, the flag officers began to rain bombs. Surprised by what they suffered in the face of this unexpected attack, the Russian soldiers tried to escape from the bombardment. During this turmoil, the Russian army shot down 2 Bayraktar unmanned combat aircraft. However, as a result of the incessant attacks of other flag officers, the Russian soldiers were cornered. At this very moment, the Russian troops who realized that they could not escape from the valley were faced with a second surprise. HIMARS and long-range Patriot missiles, which received the coordinates of the region in advance, were activated, and the Russian convoy at the target of the missile attacks took a heavy blow. Many of these missiles were packed into trucks containing most of the Russian munitions. However, at this time, a very large explosion that left the others behind added to the dust and smoke. Putin, who wanted the Russian army to launch an all-out offensive in Ukraine, decided to ship explosives in many of the munitions. However, as a result of this latest move by Ukraine, the Russian soldiers who wanted to withdraw the truck in which the explosives were collected were late, and the missile that hit the truck caused a huge explosion. After this explosion, the Russian convoy was destroyed. However, thanks to the Bayraktars who continued the bombardment, Russian munitions became completely unusable. These explosions were so violent that the sounds echoed all around, and Russian troops in the surrounding areas immediately flocked to Belgorod. However, anticipating this, the Bayraktars returned to the Ukrainian border one by one. Meanwhile, the Russian soldiers who arrived in the region did not know what to do in the face of the size of the balance sheet. And then, according to the statement of the Russian military, which informed the Kremlin, all the ammunition prepared for shipment to the territory of Ukraine was destroyed. In the face of this great loss, there was a major crisis within the Russian army. The Russian army has suffered bigger defeats against Ukraine every day, and it has faced enormous problems throughout the unjustified invasion of Ukraine launched by Russian President Vladimir Putin. While Russian soldiers are already facing an ammunition and supplies crisis in the region, the latest operation of the Ukrainian army has changed everything. Besides, it was another problem that many of the munitions that came to the Russian army consisted of old and low-quality products. In addition, the Russian army was repulsed by Ukrainian forces in many regions. During this retreat, the inventory of the Russian army, which had to leave many munitions at the front, came to the brink of exhaustion day by day, and these materials left by the Russian army resonated in the world press because many of the munitions left over from the Russian forces were very old equipment from the Soviet Union era. But the statements of Russian soldiers captured during the operations of the Ukrainian army changed everything. According to the statements of these soldiers, all the details about the inventory of the Russian army, which already has a very old ammunition stock, were in the hands of Ukraine. Thanks to this information, Ukraine has taken measures against the moves of the Russian army on all fronts, and the captured Russian soldiers continued their statements stating that the incoming ammunition consisted of fewer and older materials, stating that these weapons are not capable of responding to the Ukrainian army. The soldiers stated that many casualties were caused even during the training process because many soldiers were injured during the training due to the fact that the weapons were out of maintenance and old. This situation has shown the whole world how much Russian President Vladimir Putin values his soldiers. After these were announced in the world press, the Russian people reacted greatly. The Russian people, who have recently faced an economic crisis as a result of the sanctions of the United States and other Western countries, were thoroughly outraged by the news. After that, anti-Putin riots took place in many regions. However, in the meantime, the statements of Chechen leader Kadyrov caused a major crisis. Kadyrov threatened the protesters with sending them all to the front if they continued their uprising. Kadyrov's rhetoric has once again proved to the whole world the predicament into which Russia has fallen. After these statements, war analysts stated that Russia was thoroughly cornered, and according to war analysts, if the process continues like this, it may only be a matter of time before Ukraine ends the war with an absolute victory. In this case, it is predicted that Putin's power will also collapse. With that, Russian leader Vladimir Putin's presence in Crimea is now coming to an end. Putin's party building was set on fire in Crimea in 2014. Very interesting events began to take place on the Crimean Peninsula, which was invaded by the Russian invaders. Crimean insurgents rose up and set the streets on fire. Crimean insurgents who want Russian leader Vladimir Putin to completely withdraw his hand from Crimea have destroyed the ammunition depot that the Russian army has built in Crimea. Russian citizens living in Crimea began to flee the Crimean territory one by one after the Russian army occupied the territory of Ukraine. Many pro-Ukrainian resistance organizations were established in Ukraine and the Crimean Peninsula. These resistance organizations have made many sabotage attempts in order to prevent the activities of the Russian army in Ukraine and Crimea. The growing number of insurgents in Crimea is causing Russian leader Vladimir Putin to be very nervous. Realizing that the number of insurgents has increased considerably, Putin has sent a large number of Russian National Guards to the Crimean territory in order to prevent these insurgents. However, the Russian National Guard sent by Vladimir Putin to block the insurgents in Crimea has taken a very aggressive attitude to the Crimean citizens and detained a large number of Crimean citizens. The aggressive attitude of the Russian National Guard in Crimea has caused riots to break out in many cities. The people of Crimea are showing their reaction by organizing anti-war and anti-Putin protest. Russian citizens, on the other hand, are leaving Crimea and fleeing into Russia's borders because they think their lives are in danger. The insurgents in Crimea have been carrying out sabotage attempts against the shipping routes of the Russian army since the beginning of the war. In recent weeks, insurgents have dealt a major blow to the Russian army by making unusable a shipment route in the city of Simferopol that is often used by the Russian army. The insurgents, who opened large holes in the roads using plastic explosives, prevented the use of the path of Russian ammunition convoys. Vladimir Putin was planning to arrange a shipment of ammunition and weapons to Russian troops for the ongoing intense battle in Bakhmut. However, this planned shipment of ammunition by Putin was postponed after the insurgents blew up the road. The detonation of the road greatly angered Putin. The Russian National Guard stationed in Crimea began searching the houses of minority citizens in the region, door to door, for members of the resistance organization who were involved in this sabotage attempt. It was reported that more than 2,000 Crimean citizens were detained within a week. This aggressive attitude of Russian leader Vladimir Putin greatly carried the patience of the Crimean people, and Crimean citizens who took to the streets in rebellion launched a huge rebellion and protest. Tens of thousands of Crimean citizens have taken to the streets against these repressions and harsh moves as a result of the intervention of the National Guard against citizens. While the fact that the vast majority of citizens forcibly recruited by Russian leader Vladimir Putin into the army consist of minority citizens has led to an even greater increase in Crimean citizens. Anger against Putin and tens of thousands of Crimean citizens have begun to protest against Putin and the war by protesting against these repressions and harsh moves. These protests, which were launched in the cities of Sevastopol and Simferopol, began to grow rapidly in Brazil with the inclusion of Crimean insurgents. Putin, who is experiencing a great fear of this situation, does not know what to do. After that, Crimean citizens gathered in front of Russian leader Vladimir Putin's party building in the city of Simferopol and demanded that the building be closed and the Russian National Guard leave the Crimean territory. However, Russian security forces also tried to suppress the protests by using brute force on these protesters. Crimean insurgents began to organize attacks against Putin's party building and vehicles belonging to Russian officials, taking the action of pouring gasoline. They threw homemade Molotov cocktails towards the party building. The party building and surrounding vehicles burst into flames when a Molotov cocktail hit the places where gasoline was spilled. Pro-Putin Russian officials quickly began to leave the building. Crimean citizens who saw the Russian officials leaving the building chased the Russian officials who got into their vehicles and tried to escape and expelled them from the city. By Putin's order, a large number of fire brigades set off for the Crimean territory when the fire brigades located in Crimea were insufficient to extinguish the resulting fire. A request was made for support from the surrounding cities. As a result of the turmoil between the Russian security forces and the Crimean resistance deciders, more than 5,000 Crimean citizens were detained by the Russian National Guard. The insurgents who planned to turn the brawl into a great opportunity also carried out a major operation on the ammunition depot held by the Russian army in the city of Simferopol and managed to blow up the warehouse. Crimean insurgents who were throwing explosive materials over the wires around the ammunition depot caused a large fire to break out. The explosions triggered by the flames of the fire led to a large explosion in the warehouse. The Russian soldiers, who were also greatly affected by the impact of the explosion, began to flee the area almost without looking back. Recently, Crimean and Ukrainian insurgents have conducted many operations against Russian forces and achieved great success, causing a lot of trouble for the Russian army. As it is known, Russian leader Vladimir Putin issued Russian passports to many Ukrainian citizens and forcibly took these citizens to the territory of Russia. However, Ukrainian citizens who started living in Russia joined the pro-Ukraine resistance organizations in the region after a while. With the increase in the number of members in resistance organizations, explosions and fires within the borders of Russia have also increased significantly in recent months. A large explosion occurred at a natural gas facility, which is one of the largest sources of income for Russian leader Vladimir Putin. A large explosion that occurred in Yaroslavl, a city quite close to the capital, Moscow, makes the people of the region very nervous. The insurgents from Urkana moved towards the area where the gas pipeline is located. Late at night, Ukrainian insurgents who placed homemade plastic explosives in natural gas pipes then quickly moved away from the area. Minutes later, a large explosion occurred in the natural gas pipe, and the flames generated by the violence of the explosion continued to reach a height of meters. The explosion that occurred in the pipeline started to spread to the facility in a short time. Russian citizens who found themselves in the area thought that Ukrainian forces had carried out an airstrike, but this was not the case. The people of the region informed the fire brigades and demanded that the fire be completely extinguished. However, the fire crews in the city of Yaroslavl were by no means enough to extinguish the fire. Russian authorities have started sending fire crews from Moscow towards the city of Yaroslavl. This fire, which started late at night, could only be extinguished after hours of intervention. This explosion was not the first. Earlier, Urkana forces managed to cause major damage to a gas pipeline belonging to the Gazprom Energy Company, which is located within the borders of Russia and is of great importance. One of the gas pipelines located on the border between Russia and Ukraine was rendered unusable thanks to the artillery fire of the Ukrainian army. Ukrainian forces conducted a major operation inside the borders of Russia using mortars along with the organized operation. One of the mortars hit the Russian gas pipeline. The mortar gun that hit the pipeline caused a lot of damage. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who has officially gone crazy after the events, has started to lose another source of income. Every day in the war, the Russian soldiers who can no longer withstand the power of the Ukrainian forces continue to suffer a great defeat. The war between Ukraine and Russia continues to critically affect the countries of the Eastern European bloc. While some Eastern European bloc countries support Ukraine directly, others abstain or do not hesitate to support Russia directly. One of Russia's so-called supporters is Belarus. This country has sided with Russia since the beginning of the war. However, in this process, Belarus has shaken the agenda many times with its abstaining against the war or very daring statements and some failures with Russian politics. We see that this process has worn out the Belarusian people and politics a lot, and we see that the people, the opposition, and the Belarusian warriors fighting for Ukraine are moving towards an all-out revolt. When we look at the latest state of the country, we can understand this much more clearly. Perhaps the last thing Lukashenko and Putin wanted was for the Belarusian people and dissidents to receive training from the Polish army and for many Belarusians to fight against the Russians in Ukraine. But this is happening now. It is a known fact that since the beginning of the war, the Belarusian people have been fighting on the side of Ukraine and are against Lukashenko and Putin. However, it is seen that the situation in the country has reached very serious dimensions. As Belarusians received training from the Polish army, many of these developments are also confirmed by Lukashenko, which means that Belarusians can pull the plug on Putin and Lukashenko for Lukashenko. This dire situation may also mean turning his back on Putin to stay in power. Let's examine in striking detail the uprising of the Belarusians and the details of their training with the Polish army. The Belarusian army started to receive military training in Poland for critical situations such as the removal of Lukashenko from power and Putin's dragging Belarus into the Ukraine war. Belarusian dissidents received guerrilla sabotage and weapons training in NATO member Poland. The goal is to remove Belarusian leader Lukashenko from power and replace him with a new leader who is opposed to Putin's war and aggressive policies. In other words, the expelled opponents of the Belarusian leader Alexander Lukashenko are about to be in trouble. Belarusians, who had to flee the country, are receiving combat training in Poland. Belarusians, who receive military training, whose strength is increasing day by day, are called militants preparing to overthrow the regime. But the international media, Ukrainian sources, and Belarusians themselves call it the desire to stay away from war and live in peace and tranquility. For this, Belarusians receive sabotage, reconnaissance, observation raid weapon, drone, kamikaze drone, explosive, and anti-tank trainings trained by the Polish-backed Belarusian private military company Bipol against any danger that may be created by Putin and supported by Lukashenko. It was reported that some of these Belarusians were sent to the war in Ukraine and fought against the Russian forces, thus gaining combat experience. Belarusian opposition militants who are said to have sabotaged railways and kamikaze drone attacks hide their guerrilla activities even from their families. Belarusian exiled opposition leader Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya is making plans to return to Belarus at her mansion in Poland with NATO and Polish officials. These plans include critical tasks such as Belarusian militants waging partisan and guerrilla wars, targeting Belarusian infrastructure, and removing Alexander Lukashenko from the seat of power. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov confirmed this news while an alleged anti-regime action was allegedly planned in Belarus. Meanwhile, Ryhor Azarek, one of the key anti-war figures, gathers more evidence for Lukashenko's arrest. Ryhor Azarek again went to the occupied territory of Ukraine, where he touched on the issue of the deportation of Ukrainian civilians to Belarus. Azarek met with Sergei Talmachev, the representative of the occupation administration of the Zaporizhia region of Ukraine. Also recently, a well-known Paralympic athlete, an ardent supporter of Lukashenko, admitted in an interview with Belta that Lukashenko personally approved the deportation of Ukrainians to Belarus. Previously, this was the main reason why an arrest warrant was issued for Vladimir Putin by the International Criminal Court. Such situations do not prevent Russia from using Belarus as a military base, but Belarusian citizens do not accept such negative developments. Lukashenko, on the other hand, is putting his own future and power in jeopardy as he continues to lay the groundwork for Putin's invasion. So what were the reasons that frayed and angered the Belarusian people meeting regularly with Russian President Vladimir Putin? Lukashenko relied on the Kremlin's political and economic support to survive months of protests, mass arrests, and Western sanctions. But nowadays, Belarusians also realize the danger that the Russia-Ukraine war could pose. Anti-Lukashenko riots and opposition to Putin's war rhetoric have increased in Belarus, which shares a 1,000-kilometer or 620-mile border with Ukraine and has many citizens with family or personal ties there. Even within the Belarusian army, there are dilemmas about supporting the Russian war. Belarusian military analyst Alexander Allison reported that if the country's 45,000-strong army were sent to Ukraine, there could be mass refusals to obey orders. As you may recall, the Russian army used Belarusian lands in its ground operation against Ukraine. Currently, we see that Belarus is slowly turning into a military barracks. Everyone fears that Belarusians will not be allowed to watch the war between Russia and Ukraine from afar for too long. Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko, on the other hand, wants to maintain relations with Russian leader Vladimir Putin for the sake of self-interest, regardless of the opinions of his citizens. This interest, of course, is not to leave the seat of power. Alexander Lukashenko hosted thousands of Russian soldiers in his country, allowing the Kremlin to use it to invade Ukraine on February 24, 2022. He offered to station some of Russia's tactical nuclear weapons there. However, for the time being, he refrained from direct participation of Belarus in the war. Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced the date when Moscow tactical nuclear weapons will be deployed in Belarus. Russia's move is interpreted as a counterattack to NATO's move to expand the alliance with Finland and Sweden. Supposedly, Putin and Lukashenko had previously agreed on Russia's plans to deploy short-range land-based nuclear missiles on Belarusian territory. Russian President Vladimir Putin has announced that they will begin deploying tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus after the facilities are ready on July 7 and 8. The Russian leader said Moscow's first deployment of such weapons outside of Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union was a warning to the West to arm and support Ukraine. Alexander Lukashenko noted that Russia's tactical nuclear warheads were delivered to its close ally, Belarus. However, the Belarusian leader stressed that he does not see the need for Russia to resort to nuclear weapons for now. The United States criticized Putin's decision, but Washington officials said Putin had no intention of changing his stance on strategic nuclear weapons and saw no signs that Russia was preparing to use nuclear weapons. Russia's move, however, is closely watched by Washington and its allies, as well as by China, which has repeatedly warned against using nuclear weapons in the war in Ukraine. Analysts and political opponents say greater involvement in Ukraine could rekindle public anger against it and erode its iron-fisted dominance in power for nearly 29 years. On the other hand, Belarusian President Lukashenko's speech about the Russian-Ukraine war, which has been going on for months, fell like a bomb on the agenda with the offensive of Ukraine. Western tanks and weapons once again appeared in the region. The Russian side published images suggesting that these tanks were destroyed, but the truth was different. It was soon determined that the vehicles that the Russians destroyed as tanks were tractors. After the scandal, another fiasco shook the agenda again, stating that Putin sent him documents from time to time. Lukashenko overlooked that one of these documents was the peace plan in Ukraine. According to Lukashenko, Putin's peace plan will come soon after Russia suffered a minor defeat in Crimea. After the planned defeat, peace will be declared hastily upon the aforementioned statements being on the agenda. A response came from Moscow. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov argued that Crimea is an integral part of the Russian Federation. Lukashenko's claim came soon after Russian nuclear missiles reached Belarus. Lukashenko looked worried, speaking to Belarusian state television. As a result, all these events lead to increasing concerns of the Belarusian people that Minsk, a close ally of Moscow, will be drawn into the war. But this concern may point to a new regime in Belarus. We'll wait and see.